In those days, John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness of Judea, proclaiming, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." That's how Matthew opens up chapter 3. It's the verses 1 and 2 of the story that we often refer to as the baptism of Jesus, because that's what it is. It's a retelling of this event of Jesus going down to the Jordan River to be baptized by John the Baptist. John the Baptist is introduced here in this particular story, but Matthew is using him not so much to tell us about John the Baptist, but through the lens of John the Baptist to begin to unveil to us the answer to that question, who is Jesus? Again, our guiding question. And it's good for us to take that guiding question even as we begin to open up the story about Jesus here in chapter 3. Chapter 3 has a key story as it begins to open the story of Jesus for us. And we have an assignment this week, the Jesus baptism worksheet, that I would suggest you have a look at as we consider it today, and consider it in light of what's happening here in this text. The literary world, which is what we're focusing primarily here on in chapter 3 and on this worksheet, is what we want to focus on. Again, remember last week we talked about the three worlds model for interpretation, beginning with the literary world, moving to the historical world, and finally to the contemporary world. So today's questions are going to focus primarily on the literary world. What's happening here in the text? What's going on here as Matthew begins to answer that question and help us come to terms with our answer to the guiding question of who is Jesus. So, to begin with, let me point out a couple things, maybe two or three things here about this particular assignment and about this particular text in chapter 3. First, I want you to notice that Matthew is going to use a device of compare and contrast here a couple of times. He's going to use both the Pharisees and Sadducees early, the middle part of the section, and compare them with Jesus. And so you'll see, how does John deal with the Pharisees and Sadducees? What does he say to them? Then how does he deal with Jesus? What does he say to him? And so you take those two poles and begin to say, what is it saying about who Jesus is, that the opposite of Jesus, the Pharisees, Sadducees in this story, would be described in this way. For example, one of the things that Matthew quotes John saying is, "You brood of vipers," referring to the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so I'd like you to explore a little bit of what that is. What is that about, this idea of a brood of vipers is these folks, and how does that then help us understand again who Jesus is on the other side, if they are a brood of vipers? Also, there's another comparison and contrast, and that is the words that John speaks about himself and how that compares or contrasts, in this instance contrasting, with who Jesus is and what words John uses for Jesus. So let those two contrast kind of be the poles in which we stay between, especially as we begin to understand who this Jesus is. I'd like to just point out again, with the assignment itself, just pay close attention to the questions, the prompts, because they will help you. And don't overthink a question. When the question is, where is this? Just look in chapter 1, or verse 1. It'll tell you where it is. But they just want you to begin to work that process of understanding that that this text is trying to paint a picture for you, and wants you to get a good, clear understanding of it. Also notice that not only does Matthew quote John a number of times, what John says, but the assignment is going to ask you what is quoted about John. So be careful of that, and note that when Matthew states something, he's helping us understand a bigger picture of who John is, and through John, who Jesus is. So what does Matthew quote about John, or in reference to John? Not only in the words, but even where do those words that Matthew was quoting, where do they come from? Because that gives another glimpse into what Matthew is saying about who this Jesus is. And maybe finally, I'd like to say that it'd be important to begin to continue to follow along and understand now some of the also historical world aspects that go along with this. And how you begin to discover some of that is in our readings. For example, who is John speaking to at first? He's speaking to the Pharisees and Sadducees. And if you want to read a little bit up on that and understand better about who those folks are, on page 60, 61, 62 in the Crable book that you read last week and are reading more this week, he does a real good job of explaining who these Pharisees and Sadducees are and what that means for the story larger. Also, note at the bottom of the page, there's going to be a number of places where we get helps. For example, why does John the Baptist's appearance get so much play? Maybe there's some clues there as to why he is described with such detail, when detailed physical descriptions is really an odd thing when it comes to biblical narrative generally, and to the book of Matthew in particular. So there's a few places that both the notes at the bottom of the page as well as some of our outside readings will help guide us along as we continue to understand this story for what it is, a story of an event that happened a long time ago, but also has meaning for us as we seek to understand what Matthew is saying for us today. Okay, so I hope that helps, and I'll look forward to reading your baptism worksheets.